about the sin that you're committing through the life you're living. And that's all I have to say about that. So now let's move on to verses 28 through 32, our last 4 verses here tonight. And beginning in verse 28, reading from the New Living Translation, since they thought it foolish to acknowledge God, he abandoned them to their foolish thinking and let them do things that should never be done. In other words, God just gave them over to themselves. He gave them over to their own passions. He gave them over to their own sin. Does that say that God will not accept them again? God will not bring them back in? God will not save their soul? No, that's not what it's saying. It's just that God, at that point, had reached a point where he just said, okay, this is what you want. This is how you want to live. This is how you want to abuse what I've given you through life. Go right ahead and do it and see where it gets you. And it says that he abandoned them to their foolish thinking and let them do things that should never be done. Verse 29 says, their lives became full of every kind of wickedness, sin, greed, hate, envy, murder, quarreling, deception, malicious behavior, and gossip. They are backstabbers, haters of God, insolent, proud, and boastful. They invent new ways of sinning, and they disobey their parents. They refuse to understand. They break their promises. They're heartless. They have no mercy. They know God's justice requires that those who do these things deserve to die. Yet they do them anyway. Worse yet, they encourage others to do them too. Well, as I conclude here my last little commentary, what Paul is saying here, since we continue to refuse, or the people he's talking about, continue to refuse to acknowledge God, he gives them up to their debased minds. What is a debased mind? Well, it's a mind that lacks moral character and standard. And it results in the indulgence of every kind of sin imaginable. Paul concludes this chapter with a list of such sins. Let's go back and look at them again. He begins to list them in verse 29. Their lives became full of every kind of wickedness, sin, greed, hate, envy, murder, quarreling, deception, malicious behavior, and gossip. They are backstabbers, haters of God, insolent, proud, and boastful. They invent new ways of sinning. Wow. That's pretty bad. But, again, that sounds judgmental, but if these are the words of God, these are the words that God inspired Paul to write, because the church at Rome and every other church and every other believer that would ever read this needed to know this. This is God's will. This is God's truth. Amen. So, to conclude this, few people are likely guilty of all of these things. Even people in our day, to our modern world, and in the homosexual community, they're not all like that. They're not, some of these folks, and don't get me wrong, I'm not condoning any lifestyle that they're living. I'm talking about them as a person. Some of them are some of the kindest, gentlest, compassionate people that you could ever meet. But still, they have this sin that they're conducting in their life that God frowns upon. Just because they're kind and compassionate and gentle and giving and loving people, that will not save their soul. Amen. And the same goes for me and you, any believer. If we believe that just being a good person is going to get us to heaven, then we're way off base. And the Bible tells us that. Amen. The Bible tells us that. We are all slaves. All of us are slaves to our sins, saved and unsaved, heterosexual, homosexual. And we are all in need of salvation from the wrath of God in judgment against us. That's what we learn from these last 4 verses. Amen. Well, I hope you've enjoyed tonight's Bible study as we got through chapter 1 of the book of Romans, and I want you to continue to join me on Wednesday evenings for this Bible study. These are very, very important things that we need to learn, that Paul points out to us about the good news of the gospel, about how we are expected to be Christians, how we're expected to live as a believer. And I hope you will join me next week as we get into chapter 2. Again, this is Pastor Michael Collins of Southside Baptist Church of El Dorado, Arkansas, and a founder and director of ministry services at Faith to Victory Ministries. I want to thank you for joining me this evening, and I hope you'll be back with me next week. Until then, be blessed, be encouraged, keep moving forward, and remember, where there's faith, there will be victory. Have a blessed evening.
You're listening to the FTV Radio Network, broadcasting exclusively on Spreaker.com Internet Radio and iHeartRadio.
Looking for inspiration? Encouragement? Keep listening. It's all here. This is the FTV Radio Network.